My name is David Ignatius. I am a columnist for the Washington Post, and I'm happy to be moderating this important discussion of Iraq. At Davos, so many times over the last few years, we've said that Iraq is at a crossroads, but this year it really is true. Iraq is at a crossroads. The elections of December 15 elected Iraq's first permanent democratic government. Members of the parliament are now in the process, through their political parties, of negotiating the shape of that government and its membership. And it's fair to say that this new Iraq is in the hands of the people gathered on this platform, the Iraqis and the international friends of Iraq. And I know that everyone in this room, as they watch this process and as they listen to our conversation this morning, will be hoping that this new Iraq can find a way to achieve the reconciliation and the stability that Iraq wants and that all of Iraq's friends want for it. Because we have a large panel, I want to introduce each of the members briefly at the outset, and then I'm going to turn to the Iraqi members who are really responsible for negotiating the issues and framework of the new government and speak to them about those issues. Then I'll turn to the international friends of Iraq for their comments, and we'll continue our discussion. But let me first introduce people. I'm going to do this alphabetically. Forgive me, it's not at all in the order that you see people on the stage. But in the middle of our stage is Hamam al-Hassani, who is president of the Iraq National Assembly. He is a Sunni from Kirkuk. He served as a deputy member of the Iraqi Governing Council during the initial post-Saddam period as Minister of Industry, and as I said, is president now of the Iraqi National Assembly. To his right is Ahmad Chalabi, who is currently Deputy Prime Minister, was a prominent leader of the Iraqi opposition to Saddam's government. He formed his own secular party in the recent elections. As Deputy Prime Minister, he's worked closely with the current Prime Minister, Ibrahim Jafri. Sheikh Hamam Hammoudi, who is to my right, is president of the Constitutional Drafting Council. He's a prominent member of the largest Shia party in Iraq, the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq. He's been a key person in shaping the basic framework document, this new constitution that will guide the new Iraq. Burham Saleh, on my far right, is currently Minister of Planning and Developmental Cooperation in Iraq. He is a former Deputy Prime Minister in the interim government and has played a key role in the opposition throughout. So those are our key Iraqis representing all the essential strands of this process of discussion. Now, just briefly to note our international friends of Iraq, Senator John McCain, to my right, well known to all of us at Davos, a steadfast supporter, as you've heard over the years, of U.S. efforts in Iraq and the effort to build a new Iraq. Amr Moussa, the Secretary General of the Arab League, immediately to my right, as you know, convened the Cairo Conference, which brought together all of the Iraqi factions in November and was a key transitional effort in this process. Jack Straw, the British Foreign Secretary, has lived with, worked with, struggled with the question of building a new Iraq through his tenure. And finally, Robert Zoellick, Deputy Secretary of State for the United States, who again is crucially involved in this. I'd like to start our discussion by turning to the center of our group, to Hamam al-Hassani. I think it's fair to say that for most observers outside Iraq, and I suspect inside Iraq, the biggest development in the December 15 elections was the very large turnout of Sunni voters in Iraq who had stayed away from the polls in the earlier elections. And this led to hopes that the Sunnis might become fully partners in this new Iraq. And I want to ask you to lead off our conversation, which is about building one Iraq and trying to find reconciliation, what it will take for Sunni Iraqis to feel fully part of this new country.
Thank you. Before I give my answer to your question, I want to make the same remark that I made when I was chosen as president of the National Assembly in Iraq. When people labeled me as a Sunni leader, my answer to that, I'm an Iraqi leader, I'm not a Sunni leader. I'm Iraqi first, I'm Iraqi second, I'm Iraqi last. With all respect for the second identity, I don't think you can build the new Iraq based on dividing the people into Sunni and Shia and Kurd. I think if we want to build Iraq, and I think that's the concern of most of the Iraqis, it's not just the Sunnis, Shia and Kurd. The concern is that we want to build a citizenship country, not a country that is divided into different ethnicities or different sects. Right, you go to the history of Iraq, you will find out that there was oppression by regimes that does not represent certain ethnicity, does not represent certain sect. Saddam Hussein cannot be labeled as a Sunni leader. Saddam Hussein was a secular. He didn't care much about religion to be labeled a Sunni. A Sunni means a religious term. I think if you want to make Iraq a solid state, that's what we need to do, to build a citizenship country. I go back to the issue of the Sunnis as it is the reality right now in Iraq. People are talking about these things. I don't know, by the way, who came with that division, but when after Saddam was overthrown, we found out that Iraq is Sunni and Shia and Kurd. It doesn't make any sense when you categorize it. It's not sectarian division. It is not ethnic division. Sunnis, I think, they suffered a lot in the last 3 years because they were labeled as if, they belonged to Saddam Hussein's regime. And accordingly, because of some of the wrong policies that were implemented in Iraq, we found Iraq the way it is today. In the first election, Sunnis didn't participate. In this election, they participated. So this government, I think, is going to be more inclusive government, and I think that will lead to find solution for many different issues in Iraq, including the issue of security and reconstruction of Iraq and rebuilding of Iraq. What the Sunni wants in Iraq, I think, as any Iraqi wants, is to be respected as the others, to have roles in politics, in economics, to live like any other Iraqis are living in Iraq. We should not differentiate between the component of the Iraqi society. And let me just make one comment. For 80 years, more than 80 years, different regimes in Iraq tried to exclude the Kurds and oppress them for 80 plus years. But none of them succeeded in excluding them from the Iraqi society, from being a power within the Iraqi society. So the leaders of new Iraq, I think they should not make the same mistake, whether it is about the Sunnis or any other minorities in Iraq, to try to exclude them from the political life in Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm especially happy to be corrected on making a sectarian identification, and I won't do that again. Dr. Chalabi, you have been a strong advocate in Iraq of de-Baathification and rules for de-Baathification. The issue today, as you think about a new government, is reconciliation and how you bring Iraq together. There are news reports that we read that suggest that there's a real split in the insurgency, that some people who've been insurgents may want to stop fighting and may want to cooperate with the new government. What do you think about those reports, and what do you think about the question of reconciliation?
De-Baathification has been a humane process of healing and rehabilitation. De-Baathification was designed to stop random, uncontrolled acts of revenge against members of the Ba'ath Party. And by and large, this process has succeeded. de-Baathification was not designed to target individuals, but was designed to dismantle the apparatus of control that the Ba'ath Party has become under Saddam. And 90% at least of members of that party are not affected at all by de-Baathification. Now it's time to move on. De-Baathification is in the Constitution, but it is also in the Constitution that the new parliament is empowered to modify and even dissolve the De-Baathification Commission. And we've been now nearly 3 years since that time, and we have processes and suggestions in the De-Baathification Commission to put to the new parliament to make this process much more benign, and especially as we move forward to the trial of Saddam Hussein taking place now, we think that this will be a process of produce a process of healing and acceptance further on in Iraqi society. As for the matter of the split in the insurgency, there is indeed a very strong differentiation now between the Iraqi groups who think they are fighting occupation and the Zarqawi movement who think they are fighting the rest of the Iraqi people and are pursuing a jihadist cause which is beyond the interest and the concern of the Iraqi people. This process has been furthered along by the government, by the current government, by our policies, and we have brought together very important people in Iraqi society, especially in areas around Baghdad, and there have been clashes and serious clashes between the Zarqawi movement and the Iraqis who say they are insurgents, and we believe that the political process as it develops will induct more and more Iraqis into the process of fighting terror, even in those areas where most of the terror is taking place.
So you said something that's very important. I just want to make sure that I fully understood it and that we all did. As you form this new government, you think there will be a way to draw in people who have been fighting occupation, but now will be prepared to work with the new government because they're so sick of the Zarqawi forces and want to be part of stopping them?
Indeed, yes. We expect that, but I'm not saying that this will happen. I'm saying that this is happening now. We are seeing the effects of those, especially in the areas around Baghdad and in the areas of Anbar and Ramadi. There has been a very important development that was missed a few months back. The Zarqawi group wanted to eject all the Shia families living in the city of Ramadi and Anbar. The people of the city and the tribes of Anbar prevented them and defended those families who have been there for a long time. So this is an important sign.
Let me ask you one more question, Dr. Chalabi, because you've been involved in the question of Iraq's oil reserves and the management of those reserves. Iraqis wonder about how the oil revenues will be divided in the future, whether new oil that's discovered will, as the Constitution seemed to suggest in its draft form, be sent to the regions, which frightens people from areas that don't have a lot of oil, or whether it will be shared by all Iraqis. And I wonder if you could briefly speak to how you can resolve that in a way that will make all Iraqis feel comfortable.
One of the most important articles of the Constitution in Iraq is Article 109. It says oil and gas wealth belongs to all the Iraqi people in all the governorates and regions of Iraq. That establishes a common ownership for the people of Iraq of all oil and gas resources. Not the old ones only, but all gas and oil resources, period. Now, this is a fundamental statement in the Constitution. And this is very important to note, and this is a unifying statement, and the leaders of Iraq who formulated the Constitution were able to see their way clearly to supporting the statement, which is an act of statesmanship over and above concern for the regions. So I believe that oil and gas will be shared by all the people of Iraq. Furthermore, the Constitution also has provisions for the regions and the governorates of Iraq to initiate, in cooperation with the central government, moves to explore oil and to develop oil resources in the area, because in the past, the central government in Baghdad and the bureaucracy of the oil bureaucracy in Iraq were acting to prevent development of regional oil exploration initiatives. So I believe that our constitution has this provision, which is a unifying provision, and which we can activate through parliamentary laws. And I think that there should be no worry about the distribution of oil and gas wealth, because it is, as in the Constitution says, belongs to all the regions and the provinces and all the Iraqi people.
Let me turn to Sheikh Hammoudi. Sheikh Hammoudi, you are a key member of Iraq's largest political party and thus play a very important role in the negotiations. And I want to ask you about a key issue that you're discussing now in Baghdad, which is the future of the security ministries, the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Defense, which are obviously the most important in the new Iraq. Do you think there's a way that these two key ministries can be taken out of politics so that the people who are running those ministries are seen as being separate from any militias, any armed groups, that they're really people who represent all Iraq?
شكرا جزيلا. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. كما أشرتم أن من جملة المشاكل التي عانى منها الشعب العراقي.
Thank you. As you said, one of the main problems in Iraq and the Iraqi people is that of security, and the security system of the former regime and the one that we have now. The country is a very complex one. The military are in power. They are taking decisions for the army and in certain parts of the country or for some factions. So one of the very important and sensitive issues in the new Iraq is how we are going to deal with this security system in such a way as to ensure that the security system gives rise to peace and calm rather than unrest and concern. We also have the various factions and zones. That is a problem, of course. In the first clause of the Iraqi constitution, it is set forth very clearly how the army is considered. We have detailed provisions concerning the army and security and the security arrangements. The Iraqi army must represent the entirety of the Iraqi society, including the respect for religious precepts, and this may not be just in favor of one faction, one group, or one zone, or one part of the country. And the Constitution also forbids very explicitly the creation of militia. That is totally unconstitutional. It is forbidden by the Constitution. Not only by the Constitution, by the other laws we have passed as well. The army leadership must be civilian and not military. The armed forces may be free from political intervention and should not play a role in this political process. Moreover, we have to also bear in mind human rights, respect the basic principles that apply to the treatment of all individuals and all citizens. Furthermore, the defense minister and the minister for interior affairs, and as to their political origin or political party, well, the leaders of the government have to have as a principle the task of reassuring the population in contrast to what happened during the Saddam Hussein regime, when the attitudes of certain ministers were colored in a certain way. We have the Constitution, which helps us to make these necessary arrangements. There are independent groups that take care of human rights. We also have a ministry that is in charge of human rights, and we have a group in Parliament that is responsible for human rights, so that we are taking great care of protecting and observing human rights. There's also an independent group that monitors the setting up of the institutions, the state institutions such as the army, economic institutions, public order, and the way in which the arrangements are made have to be fair and equitable and take into account the interests of all the Iraqis. One may not give special attention to groups or factions or zones. These guarantees exist, and if human rights can be preserved and observed, then we should be able to put into practice, implement the Constitution in such a way as to guarantee a smooth functioning of all the ministries. Ministries and the composition of ministries must reflect the composition of the entire Iraqi population. Iraqi citizens should feel that they belong to Iraq and not just to a faction or a group or a zone. Of course, we can understand that some people feel they belong to a group, but the Iraqi citizenship should feel itself to be a full Iraqi citizenship without taking account of ethnic origin or religion or geographic origin. We believe that the most important functions should be attributed to Iraqis without taking into account their religious origin or their ethnic origin. A minister could very well be a Christian or come from a faction. And this is something that is new in the Iraqi constitution. It is very different from past constitutions. So if we take into account all these aspects, the security forces, the army, and bear in mind that the important posts have to be filled by Iraqi citizens, then I think they can all play their role of calming things down, reassuring citizens, and this would then be an excellent guarantee for the future. Not necessarily to choose someone who comes from a faction or a group, but to have someone who has, in the ministries, an objective view. That would be a guarantee for the future of Iraq. Thank you very much.
That certainly speaks to what I think has been the most difficult issue in the quiet discussions that are taking place in Baghdad. And I heard you say that militias have no role in the future of Iraq, and to underline the need for people who are Iraqis first in these key ministries, and that's a key point. Let me turn now to Burham Saleh. I don't know that there's anybody who's been more consistently speaking for One Iraq, but Burham, you're also a son of the Kurdish regions, and so I want to turn to you with apologies and ask you, it's often said that in this process of discussion and negotiation leading to a new government, the Kurdish parties will play a key balancing role. And as the Kurdish leaders and people in the Kurdish areas look at this process, perhaps you could tell us what they hope to see, what their key conditions are, and what they bring to the process.
David, I think it's an irony somehow that the Kurds, who have often been accused of being the threat to the unity of Iraq are emerging as the unifiers of Iraq. And truly, we have a stake in the success of Iraq, in the success of a democratic federal Iraq that will be at peace with itself and at peace with its neighbors. And we know that that vision cannot be attained without reconciliation inside Iraq and without an inclusive political process. If we were to look at the present electoral map, it may be conducive to our own immediate interest as the Kurdish alliance to go it alone with the United Iraqi Alliance, the so-called Shia alliance. To be fair to our colleagues in the UAE, they also insist on the notion of a national unity government. We have made it upon ourselves in the Kurdish alliance that we want to be a catalyst for a truly unifying government that will represent all Iraqis, because we know that without that there can be no stability and can be no security in Iraq, and we cannot attend to the urgent needs of Iraq in terms of reconstruction and improving services. That is why we have decided that we would be calling for a national unity government that will be including the UAE obviously being the largest parliamentary bloc, the Kurdish alliance, the Tawafuk, which is set to represent the Sunni heartland, and the Iraqi list led by Dr. Ayad Alawi. We believe that these four components represents the majority of Iraqi political spectrum. We believe that Iraq at this stage of its transition needs as wide as possible political unity to face up to the security, political and economic challenges. And by including all these key components in the next government, I believe we will have a good chance at turning the corner and devoting the resources of Iraq not to just fighting an insurgency, but to what is more important, namely improving the services and improving the quality of life for the people of Iraq.
That's, again, I think a key statement from a key balancer, arguably the kingmakers in this process of what they're looking for, and they're going to insist on reconciliation and a government that's very broad. Let me turn now to the international friends who were the midwives of this process in some ways, and who obviously will help shape it with their own views. And let me turn first to Foreign Secretary Jack Straw. Foreign Secretary, as you've listened to the Iraqis who were in the process of negotiating and forming the new government, I'm curious about what your reactions to what you've heard and what the British view is of what a successful outcome would be in these negotiations.
Well, I'm optimistic, as I was when I was in Iraq talking to many of the leaders here and their colleagues just 2.5 weeks ago. And the progress made in Iraq, notwithstanding the terrible and continuing violence, is remarkable. 3 successive polls, 2 elections, 1 referendum last year. Frankly, I remember being one of my many visits in Baghdad in November 2004, talking to the people who were going to run the elections and the UN, being very pessimistic about whether this just administrative challenge was achievable, still less the political challenge. Well, it has been, and the turnout in the last elections in Iraq was significantly better than the turnout in either the United States or the United Kingdom in equivalent general elections. And it shows just what a powerful force in the souls and hearts of the Iraqis, as it is elsewhere, is democracy. A national unity government is what the Iraqis want, and it's not David for us to dictate to the Iraqis, but it's perfectly obvious that given its fractured history, and I understand what is said about the need to get away from sectarianism, but you also, it's a bit like, in a way, the simplest situation in Northern Ireland. You can't avoid the fact that people come from different religious traditions, and these, in a way, have been accentuated in the last 3 years. They just have. Although that's not to say that there have been many mixed tribes, there are many, many more mixed marriages, and for a very long time, the issue of whether you were Sunni or Shia was not as significant as people now think it is. But it's there, so you need a government of national unity. You don't only need a government of national unity in terms of sort of external label. The next challenge is to ensure that the way that government works is by consensus which day by day and week by week is able to bind in all the groups. Because if all that happens under a government of national unity, that the arguments are transferred from the Parliament or Legislative Council into the Cabinet, but you still have what could be criticized as a dictatorship of the majority, then you will end up with real problems of sectarianism. So, and the point I often make to my Iraqi friends is that, yes, democracy is about ensuring that the majority have the greater say, but it's relative. But one absolutely fundamental test of any democracy is the rights which a democracy and the majority accord to minorities. The last point I'd make is this, and I'm just struck at talking more and more intensively to Iraqi politicians, and if they'll excuse me for saying so, and it doesn't apply to anybody on this platform, but how varied is the experience of democratic politics. And we actually there's quite a task there. Just, I mean, one professional politician to another, got good experience of politics, but to some extent, I've been struck that the answer to the question, what happens next, which may be obvious to someone who's been in the maelstrom of democratic politics, as I have for 40 years, is different from somebody who had to operate within this tyrannical, non-democratic environment for so many decades in Iraq. And we sometimes need to both aim off for that, but also understand that it's in that area, not in terms of continuing military presence, that maybe that there should be our greatest involvement for the future.
Foreign Secretary, the British have special responsibility and expertise on the situation in southern Iraq. And perhaps you could briefly give us your sense of how things are going in the south and whether it will be possible for the British to withdraw substantial numbers of troops over the course of this year as the security situation improves.
Well, we've had some difficulties within Basra, much less so in some of the surrounding provinces. Our aim, as indeed is the aim of the United States and the other coalition troops elsewhere, is to make decisions province by province as the Iraqi security forces in that province and the political apparatus is believed by the Iraqi government to be acceptable, then for us to draw down our troop levels. We hope to do some of that during the course of this year in at least 2 of the provinces, not Basra. I can't give a date and I can't give numbers, but that's our intention.
Let me turn to Deputy Secretary Zelek. As you and Secretary Rice and Ambassador Khalilzad in Baghdad watch this process, and as you listen to the comments today, what are your thoughts, and how does the United States hope to shape the process?
Well, first, I want to mention, as I walked into the preparation room and recognized that I had the opportunity on a number of visits of Iraq last year to meet all the members of this panel, and having dealt with a lot of countries over some 25 years, I just want to say that in full sincerity, the talents, the commitment, and indeed the physical courage of the people that are up here is really extraordinary. And in the bigger picture of what is being done in Iraq and its importance to the region, it's just something worth taking note. And as Jack mentioned, the thing that I've frankly been most impressed with, because I've not only had a chance to talk to these people in Iraq, but work with them on particular problems, is in what is obviously an extraordinarily difficult situation, people are trying to make democratic politics work, build constitutions, and frankly, it's pretty impressive. As for what needs to be done, Jack highlighted the key pieces, but frankly, we're building off what they said. There needs to be a national unity government. Obviously, we're very interested in the coherence of how that government works, as Jack mentioned. I would add to it the competence, particularly in core ministries, security, defense, interior, some of the economic ministries. There will be an issue that is a leftover issue of how, as the key positions are put together, one deals with the constitutional amendment question, and whether that is noted, set aside, identified some points, put on at a different framework. That'll be a key element. But it's also good to have Amr Moussa here, because I think another key point will be not only how the United States, Britain, and others of the broader coalition engage with Iraq, but frankly, how others in the Arab world do so. including some of the Gulf states. And I've talked with Barham Saleh and Finance Minister Alawi, who's here. I think there's an important opportunity in developing the program, which would be the last key point, I'd say, because the government obviously has to decide what it's going to focus on, that some of the external participants help emphasize the key steps that need to be taken, because in dealing with an insurgency or terrorism, it's always a question of how you deal with the security aspects, the economic and building aspects, and the political aspects together. So where I get my optimism from is the people that I've dealt with. And I've frankly told them, and some other countries I've dealt with in other regions, when I've been trying to work on knotty problems, I get on the plane, I'm a little bit concerned. But this group, while it's got an extraordinary challenge, has some extraordinary people.
Secretary Zelek, you're privy to information that most of the rest of us are not, and as you read the reports from U.S. military commanders and others on the scene in Iraq, do you find evidence that supports what Dr. Chalabi was saying, that there is now a real split within the insurgency and that there's a chance to co-opt and bring over elements that have been fighting against this new Iraqi government, but now want to take part in change?
Well, I'm not only wary to comment on intelligence sources, but I'm wary to comment on their credibility, so I'll follow what Dr. Chalabi says as much. But I think the answer is clearly yes. And you see, and it's been reported in your paper and others about some of the different splits and different causes. And just to connect that, because we were talking about the stakes here. Part of the discussions here at Davos has been, the challenge of bringing democracy and a freedom agenda to the Middle East. Well, that's what this is, after what frankly have been decades of totalitarian, brutal rule. So it's not surprising that it's difficult. But you can also see its effect in the region. When I've talked with some younger Iraqis, not surprisingly, they have contacts with people in Iran, and there are young Iranians who were talking to them about saying, we think that the democracy and the freedom is very important in Iraq, and we hope that it comes to Iran. And it's clearly related to the Syria agenda. And as I think Dr. Chalabi mentioned, you have a different view in the Zariri letter, which was, no, what we want to build is a caliphate and deal with the infidels and the apostates and build a different future. That is what is at stake here in terms of the political and security agenda. And so in that sense, look, what 2006 I think is going to be a very key year. And the people on this table have identified the core issues of how you build the politics into the security side. Obviously, another key element is the standing up of the Iraqi security forces, and you've seen the numbers of, I think the last I saw was some 37 battalions that are sort of able to operate pretty much on their core ability. That's with just sort of support from the U.S. forces. That's going to be key. But I also don't want to sort of underestimate the degree of the challenge, because the people that don't want this to succeed, and I don't only mean the people in Iraq, but some others in the neighborhood, they also recognize the stakes, and they're going to fight very hard to stop it.
Let me, on that note, turn to someone in the neighborhood, as it were, Secretary General Amr Moussa, who I know very much does want to see the new Iraq succeed. Secretary General, you played a key role through the Arab League in convening a conference that brought together all of the different Iraqi political tendencies in Cairo, and I know you want to follow on that effort. One question that the Arab press is discussing is whether the Arab League might organize an effort to send in Arab troops as U.S. troops are drawn down in Iraq to help provide a measure of stability. But tell us a little bit about what you're trying to do at the Arab League.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, the problem in Iraq is not only a problem for them, for our brothers in Iraq, but for the region, for the Arab world, and for the whole world. We are all now on the same side trying to help Iraq. It's not a question of criticizing this power or that power, but Iraq will not emerge from where it is without regional and international cooperation, taking into consideration that Iraq has gone through a very, very difficult period and then suffered from a policy that perhaps inadvertently raised problems among communities, among sects, among religions, which is very serious and very negative, I must say. So the Arab League has to cater to Iraq, the Iraqis, and here I agree fully with what Speaker Hajim al-Hassani has said, that first of all, one has to feel that he or she is Iraqi. And then comes any other quality for the person or for the citizen. I am optimistic about the future of Iraq because of this community of action, and that all of us feel that we have to do something and to perform our duties to get Iraq to be the new Iraq that we all call for. But there are two things I must emphasize. A, this question of Shia and Sunnah and Arabs and Kurds and Christians and Muslims has to come to an end. We are in the 21st century, and this is a wrong attitude and a very serious and dangerous policy. That's number one. Number two, Iraq should not be the theater of any regional or international rivalry or confrontation or opposing policies. The regional situation in the Middle East does not afford to get another problem of that magnitude. For that, we have called for, with the agreement of the Iraqi leaders on all sides, that we have to sit together in a reconciliation process or in an effort to reach an accord among the Iraqis, which we did. And one day, last November, in Cairo, in the Arab League, the conference convened, there were 900 Iraqi leaders at the same time in or around the building where the conference took place. All of them from all walks of life, from all regions in Iraq. It started with a very heated debate and confrontations, but at the end, all of them exchanged their cellular phone numbers. They were so kind and started to agree on how to meet and how to work together. The net result was the participation in the elections. All factions participated, and all of them are now trying to have a national unity government and to move ahead to a new Iraq. The next step would be to convene a grand conference, because the one in Cairo was the preparatory conference. The next one, the grand conference, with the approval and encouragement and support of all the leaders in Iraq and all political forces. We hope that this conference would take place in Baghdad in March, next March, February or March, where a new Iraq would emerge based on unity in diversity. And what we heard today from Sheikh Hamam about the necessity to have personalities with vision and commitment to head the sensitive ministries, or what Dr. Shalabi has said about Article 109 of the Constitution, that the wealth of Iraq is a common ownership for all Iraqis. All that is very reassuring, I must say. Finally, the question you asked me about forces, Arab troops. The issue was raised a year or year and a half before. The position is that we have no request from a sovereign government in Iraq, and the sovereign government has not yet been formed. That's number one. And the second is the consensus of the Iraqis. You have a parliament now. There is a parliament, and that all factions are there. Consensus that there is a need for Arab countries or some of them to send troops, and the conditions under which they would work. Certainly, they would not be forces of occupation, and they shouldn't be. Secondly, we have to agree on the dimensions, the timing, and all details of that. But the point is, there is no formal request, and the request has to come only from the government of Iraq and to be discussed only within the Arab family of nations, and the conditions under which such troops would work, should be agreed fully and in extreme clarity.
Turn finally to Senator McCain. Senator, as much as anyone in Washington, I think you have watched the process in Iraq, sometimes worried as you saw what was happening, sometimes anguished as you saw what was happening. I'm curious what you think people, your colleagues in the Senate and the House, the American people would think if they were listening to this discussion, and how you think American support for this process, fragile as it is, can be maintained going forward.
Well, I think that the American people and the President's leadership has been pretty steadfast. I think Americans have been frustrated from time to time over the fact that over-optimistic statements have been made about Iraq, and then there have been setbacks. I think the President did an excellent job, and it was reflected somewhat in the polls in a series of 4 speeches that he gave just a short time ago, where he laid out our objectives and our goals, and frankly admitted some of the errors that have been, or acknowledged some of the errors that had been made in our conduct and our involvement in Iraq. It's interesting, David, you ask Americans, do you want to withdraw from Iraq? And the majority say, yeah. Then you ask the question, do you want it immediately? And the majority say no, because the American people are aware that a preemptory, abrupt withdrawal would have significant and catastrophic consequences. It's also about leadership. There are predictions that as the elections next November approach, there'll be greater pressures to withdraw American troops. I am confident that this President will withdraw American troops only dictated by the situation on the ground. And I am confident that the Congress of the United States, with a lot of agonizing and hand-wringing, will also stay that course. I'd just like to mention one other aspect of this. If Americans were watching this panel today, I think they would be very encouraged by the remarks that we've heard, particularly from the Iraqi leadership. But I think it's also important to acknowledge, those of us who have paid close attention, that there are significant challenges that have to be met, both militarily, economically, and politically. And that 3-legged stool is not yet strong enough, and I believe that in all 3 areas you could see where there is urgent need for significant approval. And I won't chronicle all of them, but I want to also just mention one other thing in conclusion. It's not the presence of American troops that bothers Americans. It is the casualties of American troops. We've had troops in South Korea for more than 50 years. I've yet to see a demonstrator that says, get out of South Korea. But what we need to do is reduce our casualty rate, and the way you do that is obvious. You have Iraqi military and security forces assume more and more of the responsibilities, which then indicate the kind of progress, and then a need for withdrawal is lessened, because the ideal scenario would be the Iraqi military and law enforcement, which is way, way behind, by the way, to be able to take over these responsibilities. Americans withdraw to enclaves and eventually leave. But my feeling of the climate and political climate in the United States of America is, with the President Bush's strong leadership, that we in the Congress are willing to give this experiment a chance. In fact, not only a chance, but our support. But we believe also the next 6 months to a year are critical, and it is more in the hands of the Iraqis than it is the Americans.
In our first round of conversations, the Iraqi members of our panel came close to negotiating the framework of a new government. So we want to give them a chance to go the rest of the distance in another brief round of questions. And I want to turn back to Speaker Al-Hassani. In the Cairo conference that Amr Moussa hosted, the gathering of Iraqi political groups talked about their desire to seek a withdrawal of American troops. And it's no secret that most Iraqis would like the occupation to end. And I'm wondering, when a new government is selected, do you think it would be a good idea or a bad idea for there to be discussion and perhaps negotiation with the Americans about the beginning of some kind of timetable or understanding about eventual U.S. withdrawal?
I think there is a real understanding between Iraq and the United States about this issue. There is a formula that has been agreed upon, that the withdrawal of the troops from Iraq should be a function of building Iraqi securities to the degree that we will be able and capable in defending our internal and external securities. I think that formula needs to be put in our mind every time we talk about a withdrawal. It's very easy, for the leadership of some Iraqi communities to come out and say, we don't want foreign troops in Iraq. What are the consequences of not having foreign troops in Iraq? A lot of people, they don't think about it. And when you go to private meetings, the same people who are calling for the withdrawal of troops from Iraq, they speak differently about that issue. So to be honest, with our people, with the world leaders, I think it is very important for Iraq, after the dissolving of Iraqi army, you cannot have enough security in Iraq unless you got the support of the friends who are helping us in Iraq. And we need to build our securities in a way, first of all, to be very inclusive, as Sheikh Hamam mentioned, that includes all sectors of Iraqis. Second of all, to be very capable, well-equipped. And third of all, the values that these troops are built upon it. The loyalty of these troops to be to the nation, not to the parties, not to ethnicity, not to a sect. These are very important things, three important things we need to do when we build our troops. Are we there yet? I don't think so. I think we still have, some critical issues to resolve within building our security forces. So again, I think the withdrawal of the troops from Iraq should be a function of building our own securities.
In the area where the fighting has been most intense, which is the Al-Anbar region to the west of Baghdad, do you see any prospect that local security forces can be built up this year in a way that would allow some reduction in the U.S. military presence in that area and a real Iraqi security presence?
3 years ago in the governing council in Iraq, I talked about a theory or a strategy to win the battle against terrorism. And I think if people listened to me at that time and we implemented that strategy, we would have been in a different situation in Iraq. The strategy is very simple. Win the people in the area, make them be part of the political process, isolate the terrorists from the communities, and then eliminate these bad elements of terrorists. This is a very simple strategy. Now we are getting there. In Ramadi, in Mosul, in other areas, the communities over there, they participated in the last election, so they're going to be part of the decision-making in Iraq. Now that we are including them in the security apparatus in Iraq, now we are winning their hearts. We are providing services to them. And I think what will happen, naturally what will happen, is what started to happen, that people will start to defend their communities against those terrorists. The most difficulties we have is to deal with those terrorists who are coming from outside Iraq. The borders were open for a very long time, and they penetrated these borders. Of course, we got not to forget that there are, as Secretary Zalek mentioned, there is outside interference. Other countries have some interest in Iraq. And I don't mean only neighboring countries. Probably there are some non-neighboring countries have interest in Iraq that to see Iraq to stay in the situation that it is in it. So the equation, it is not Iraqi exclusive equation. Factors are not Iraqi exclusive factors. Region has to play part of it. International community has to play part of it. And I think at the end, the success is what everybody is looking for it, and we cannot afford anything else but to succeed in Iraq.
Dr. Chalabi, we all know from our different experiences that it's much easier to talk about unity than it is day-to-day to make it work. It's the day-to-day part that's difficult. One idea that I gather the Americans have advanced as they've talked with you and others on the panel and others in Baghdad about the shape of the new government is a structure that would provide for some kind of national security council type group. A group that's representative of the different parts of the Iraqi fabric that would operate by consensus so that there'd be a way for Iraqis to gather and reach consensus decisions on a day-to-day basis. Do you think that's a good idea? Is that something that you think might work and help the situation?
First of all, talking about unity doesn't make it so. I support the idea that Iraqis should think of themselves as Iraqis. I support this completely, and it is an ideal that we must work for. Unfortunately, Iraq now, the political situation is the sum of the fears of the Iraqis. We must overcome this fear in detail, not through platitudes. We must work to overcome it on the security issue, on the economic issue, on the services issue, and on hopes for the future. A successful government in Iraq requires political agreement of all communities. This is not about majorities or minorities. Fundamental issues in Iraq cannot be decided on issues of majorities and minorities alone. There must be an acceptance by the Iraqi polity of a government by everyone, not by a restricted community, and the government must not feel that it is there to empower a community against another one. The people must feel that the government is for them in reality, and that is not an easy thing to do. The other thing we must do is we must fight corruption. We must eliminate corruption, which has been ingrained in the Iraqi administrative process over several decades. And again, this is not a simple matter. The money is too much and it is too sweet. And the experience of the previous 3 years, 2 years previously really, has not been very positive on this issue. We must work and create structures and cooperate with, not only in Iraq, but also with the international community and with our Arab neighbors to make this thing successful. And the third thing we must do is we must ensure that the young people of Iraq feel that they have a future in the country. The unemployment is rampant. There are no programs now to really deal with this unemployment issue and fix it and just remove this threat from the lives of young people coming out into the workplace now. As you said, there is discussions about this kind of national security kind of government. I must say to you, first of all, that we must welcome the results of the elections, and we must not at all in any way detract from them. And it is now up to the leaders of the groups that, in the parliament to support such a program. Having said that, I think that they do. I think that everyone realizes that a government cannot have people based in charge of security ministries or in charge of major economic and service ministries chosen on the basis of sectarianism, but rather they should be chosen on the basis of competence with the support of the parliament. And I think this will work. And I believe this is one of the few options that are open to us. And it is very encouraging to see our friends who have supported us in the liberation of Iraq support such a concept.
A problem for the interim government that has been in power was that it got off to a slow start. And I'm wondering if you have two ideas you could summarize in a couple sentences for what the new government could do in the first 100 days. In American politics, we always think of the first 100 days as the time to hit the ground running, as we say. What could this new Iraqi government do in the first 100 days that would make a difference and change perceptions?
You know, you've had a government in the United States for about 250 years. We've had the government for 7,000 years. It is, for us, 100 days are important, but again, don't take the same measure. We are in a hurry, but I would say to you, what we need to fix immediately are three things: security, finance and economics, that means oil and how we spend the oil revenues, and services, provision of services for the Iraqi people. Those are the three things we must fix, and the signs will be there when the government is formed, whether these are going to be fixed or not, and the people will see the importance to come from the way the people to run these things are chosen, and also I think that they will move forward with this concept, but it's not about 100 days.
You'll forgive me. I'm a journalist. It was hard to resist asking you what you do on day one. I was giving you 100 days. Let me turn to Sheikh Hammoudi. You are the man who really has been responsible for the drafting of the Iraqi constitution and the character of the new Iraqi state. And I know this audience would be especially interested in how you would describe what the religious character of that state will be. There have been concerns that the new Iraq might become an Islamic republic, something like Iran. My sense from the Constitution is that you don't want that, but I'd love to hear your description of what kind of state Iraq will be. And second, Sheikh Hammoudi, if you could speak about the process of amendment of the Constitution by the Parliament as was set forth in the procedures last fall.
نعم. يمكن القول أن الدستور الجديد يبني لدولة تختلف بشكل كامل عما كانت عليه.
A state entirely different from the previous one. Currently, we're in a construction phase, or in the phase of construction of a state totally different from the previous one. The previous structure was a presidential system. The president had wide powers. While we, in the new constitution, are building a parliamentary state, Parliament has wide prerogatives down to the details of appointments of the judiciary, the military, and so on and so forth. In the past, that former state, and for more than 100 years, was a state that relied on a given political, intellectual dimension and the Arab nationalist dimension and outlook. This state is a state aimed at protecting the individuality of the Iraqi citizen through guaranteeing its main rights and liberties as guaranteed by the Constitution. Another comment is this state, or rather, the former state was one that simply gathered in the oil revenues, and the governor decided the expenditure. This new state is a state based on oil revenues, but it is the custodian of the revenues and shall provide opportunities for its investment, for international presence. The government or the economy will not be a dirigist one guided by the government. The previous government, the previous state, was not a pluralistic one intellectually or culturally or politically. It did not give the various components of our society, ethnic, religious, political, any possibility of freedom of action or speech. The new constitution fully recognizes all ethnic and religious entities, even to the point of freedom of expression of their own languages. It admits cultural, religious, and intellectual pluralism. This new state is one that adopts two measures in all its legislation and actions to defend national identity and to defend international law. And these require respect for Islamic rules and principles, the Islamic identity, at the same time respect for liberties, human rights, and freedoms of the individual. Between these two limits and these two guidelines, we can provide respect for cultural identity and respect for the new international outlook. Within these two limitations, we hope we shall be able to give a new outlook, a new shape of democracy in its widest meanings, as well as respect for national and cultural identity and characteristics. Should democracy succeed within these two limitations, we shall then open up horizons in our region, because previously democracy was deemed contrary to the religious culture and national culture. In this new constitution, we do not impose the hijab on anyone, on any woman, but at the same time, we do not approve of a law that would prevent women from wearing the hijab. So this is simply put. Thank you.
Thank you for that, and the applause shows you how grateful we are for that very clear statement of what this Constitution and what this new Iraq are really about. Burham Saleh, let me ask you about a very difficult question facing your country, and that is how to maintain a satisfactory, even a happy relationship with your powerful neighbor to the east, Iran. Iraq fought a war with Iran during the 1980s. The question of Iran's influence over the new Iraq is one that's talked about often in the United States, and I'm sure is talked about often all over Iraq. And forgive me for throwing a hot potato in your lap, but speak a little bit, if you would, about how the new Iraqi government will think about this problem.
I thought that we were friends, David. This is undeniably one of the most difficult issues confronting the new Iraqi state. Iran is a very important neighbor of ours. We have more than 1,400 kilometers of borders. The nature of Iraq-Iran relationship historically has been that of conflict and war. We have suffered a great deal as a result of that. The Iranians have suffered a great deal of that too as well. So I'm talking about Iraqi national interest lies in pursuing a stable relationship with Iran that based on cooperation and based on non-interference in domestic affairs of either country. Moving from that historic pattern to what we aspire to will not be easy. And regrettably, I would say Iraq is in the heart of the Middle East. I wish we were an island in the Pacific. We are right there, and we are burdened with all the cross currents of the region. With all the issues, including Iran, that we have to contend with. We remind our neighbors in Iran that a stable, democratic Iraq that is at peace with itself is also in their national interest, because by definition that will be a country that will be at peace with its neighbors. And Iraqis should be given the space by which they can come up with their own solutions and without undue interference in our domestic affairs. And we definitely want to emphasize that we do not want our country to be used as a staging post for any conflict with any of our neighbors, including Iran. Iranians, and for that matter the other neighbors, have suffered a great deal from Saddam Hussein. They are, next to the people of Iraq, are the ones who have benefited most from the removal of Saddam Hussein's regime. And the neighborhood should be strategic in its thinking about the future of Iraq. Stability and peace in Iraq is in their interest, and that should be the strategic investment. In that context, let me pose the following notion. Iraq, in a way, was the North Korea of the Middle East for a long, long time. We have really the opportunity to turn Iraq around to the South Korea of the region, with the resources, economic, human talent, and the pivotal geography that Iraq has. We can be a pillar for stability. We can be a pillar for regional cooperation and integration. And this is the challenge for the neighborhood. We in the Iraqi political leadership owe it to our people to offer them, at this juncture of our history, a decent government, a national unity government, a competent government that can really work on developing the economy, improving the services, and improving the quality of life. And also assures the region as well that this government will be one that wants to work with the region. And in turn as well, given the fact that we live in this interconnected world, and that we are burdened with all the problems of the world, including international terrorism, and you name it, the international community, I believe, has also an obligation towards Iraq and towards the Iraqi political process. And I believe embracing Iraq and supporting Iraq through this difficult transition is not only in our interest, but also in the interest of the international community. Obviously, we are grateful for what we have received from the donor community so far, certainly from the United States and the United Kingdom and other Japan and other members of the international community who have been there to help us through this difficult transition. But Iraq's reconstruction needs, Iraq's economic revival requires a lot more. I believe the time has come for the international community, and particularly the region, to really step up to the challenge and think of what is needed in Iraq on the scale of what was done for Germany, Japan, and South Korea, a Marshall Plan for Iraq. I would like to go to Senator McCain in the Senate and ask him for more money, but the little I know about American political dynamics, I know that they will continue to help us, but will not be enough for what I need for the reconstruction of my country. My neighbors, and particularly the Arab neighbors of Iraq, who have a vital stake in this thing, they should truly be part of this ambitious mission and invest in making Iraq a stable, prosperous member of the regional community. It is not an impossible mission. The title of this session, David, was "What is at stake in Iraq?" A lot is at stake at Iraq. Iraq is the epicenter of change in the Middle East. And the outcome of the political process is truly of immediate consequence, not only to the Iraqi people, but to the region and beyond, I would say. Failure in Iraq is not an option by any stretch of imagination. Failure is catastrophic, not only for the people of Iraq, but for the entire region. And as Senator McCain has said, one should not underestimate the impediments before us as well as we go. I mean, on this panel, the various representatives of Iraqi polity have been talking nice and so on, but as soon as we get back to Baghdad, we will do politics as usual, and we will be fighting it out and so on. But I think with a bit of support and engagement from our friends in the international community, and also from our Arab brothers, I think we can do it. Success is difficult, is exceedingly difficult, because the stakes are so high. Our success means the failure of all the forces of backwardness and tyranny and terrorism that wants to keep grip of that region. But success is not impossible either, and it is worth investing in. And I hope that through this forum, this notion with the establishment of a new government of Iraq, that we as Iraqis, first and foremost, not only lay the responsibility on the international community or on the neighbors, we also step up to the challenge and offer our people something decent, something credible, something coherent, assuring the international community and our neighbors that we can do the job. And then I hope that the neighbors, particularly our Arab neighbors, and the international community can step up to the challenge and help us through this difficult transition, and I hope that can be done.
We have less than 5 minutes remaining, and I'm going to ask the two key international friends on the podium, Foreign Secretary Straw and Deputy Secretary Zelek, who've been so deeply involved in this Iraq process, to in one sentence state what one thing they would want to see, what one wish they would have for this group of people and for the new Iraqi government going forward. So, Foreign Secretary, what one wish would you have?
Well, it's unity, but it's one wish I've got for us, which is that we shouldn't freak out about the prospect of parties being involved in the government in Iraq who show respect or subscription to their religion. America is secular up to a point. There's only one really secular country in Europe, which is France. Italy, Greece, Poland, England all have state churches. As the source of the physical authority of the state, I, as Home Secretary, Interior Minister, used to swear in bishops before Her Majesty, the spiritual head of the Church of England, who had been appointed by the Prime Minister. So the interaction of church and state, religion and politics is complex. As Sheikh Hammoudi said, the key here is not whether you have this interaction, but whether the countries are democratic and allows minorities rights. If my constituents are entitled to wear the headscarf or indeed the burqa, so is Sheikh Hammoudi's, provided it's not a duty, but it's a right, and other religions and no religions are also respected. So we don't freak out about that. It's like Europe.
Secretary Zelek, it's going to be hard to top "Don't freak out," but give it a try. What one wish do you have?
Well, like Jack, I'm going to use some semicolons in my one sentence. I'll just make two points. One, Senator McCain was kind enough to talk about the president's leadership, but what I just want to underscore is that in our political system, with a challenge as big as this, not only fighting a war, but all the tremendous challenges afterwards, it's critical to have leadership elsewhere in the political system. And frankly, he's challenged the administration appropriately, he's pushed issues, he's identified things, but he's also stood with the process. So I want to thank him for that. The second point is, in terms of what the one thing I'd want, I want what these people want. Well, if you've listened to this, that's what the tremendous opportunities that's been created. And just to build on Barham Saleh's point about the stakes, I always keep in mind there was a speech that, to be broad in the regional scope, that Go Chok Tong gave about what is at stake dealing with the broader questions of radical Islam and terrorism. And he described it as a battle for the soul of Islam. And he made the point that ultimately that battle is going to have to be fought by Muslims, but others can help and create the conditions. And frankly, what you hear today is people engaging in that struggle and trying to create a future for Islam that has a role for democracy, a role for rights, a role for security in its neighborhood, and those are huge stakes.
Let me bring this to a close by just summarizing what I heard in response to the basic issue of what's at stake and how will the new government that's being formed deal with the questions. I heard from a broad spectrum of Iraqis the sentiment that there is one Iraq, that it should be for all of its citizens, including some citizens who've been fighting the occupation. I heard that the oil revenues of this one Iraq need to be shared by all Iraqis, which is a key issue going forward. I heard that the security ministries, defense and interior, have to be staffed by people who are seen as above politics, who are competent and professional. I heard a description of the Iraqi constitution, which was clear, articulate, and I think gave encouragement to all of us that this is a firm foundation for a new state. So I want to say on my behalf, and I'm certain for everybody in this room, that we wish all of the Iraqis who've joined us today good luck as they go back to Baghdad and work on the details of this effort, and we hope to get a progress report a year from now. Thank you very much.